the Jeffrey Power Trust invites artist Rina Kalat, Firi Rahman, and architect Sumayya Vally to make site-specific work at Lunuganga, and it's my absolute honor to introduce you to the panel we have sitting here today. Reena is a Mumbai-based artist and works with diverse media to deliberate conflict and coexistence. Her work is anchored in archival research. Reena's artworks probe critically into history, collective memory, identity, and perception through careful considerations of materials such as official records, state constitutions, maps, and archaeological surveys. Reena kicks off this set of installations at Lunuganga for the first season with an outdoor work that she has up on Cinnamon Hill and a series of her art that have been placed within the main house at Lunuganga. The garden provides a backdrop for Rina Kalat to delve into her interests of social and political borders that you would experience when looking through her exhibit. Next, we also have Sumayya Vally, who is founder and principal architect of Counterspace, an award-winning design, research, and pedagogical practice searching for expressions for hybrid identities and territory. And she's very much a great inspiration for young architects, especially girls in the global south. She also designed the 20th Serpentine Pavilion in London, making her the youngest architect to do so. We also have Sri Lankan artist Firi Rahman. His work is often concerned with contentious relationships we have between humankind and the animal kingdom. He's particularly interested in the interactions between animals and the urban environment and the responsibility societies share in protecting biodiversity. His work is intimate and sensitive with its engagement with wildlife. He's also the co-founder of We Are From Here, a collective project which highlights a deeply interconnected community in Silva Island, whose home base is increasingly threatened by gentrification for state and corporate interests. To start off this conversation, we have Rina Kalat in conversation with our trustee, Suhanya Raffel. Suhanya was appointed as executive director at M+ Museum in Hong Kong in November 2016 and has over 30 years of experience as a museum curator and leader. She is also a board member of the International Committee for Museums and Collections of Modern Art. And we also have here our chief curator, Shayari Silva, and we will have a conversation then moving towards from season 1 with Rina Kalat towards maybe looking at our future for the next 2 seasons with Sumayya as well as Firi.
I just want to thank you all for coming today to kick off our, at Lunuganga, the celebration of 75 years of really one of the most extraordinary spaces, architectural spaces, gardens in the world. And I want to begin actually by acknowledging the many hands that take to make places like this. Beginning with, of course, Jeffrey, who is here with us, but also the collaborations that have taken place over many years, including the gardeners, who are instrumental in making this garden what it is and that we are enjoying at this moment. So it's wonderful to be able to say that this work, it's a living garden. This is living work, and the relationship between creative people as well as custodians are very intertwined. And as trustees, we feel honored to be able to work in a situation that I think brings one of the most important things, which are positive things in the world, good things that we do. And collectively to take moments to think about what that means is really important. And right now we're celebrating 75 years of the garden with conversations with 3 amazing creative people that want to work with us. And so we will also want to say thank you for saying yes. And I'll begin with Rina to say thank you for saying yes. There are 9 works that she has brought to this space, including a group of really important works in the house. So I urge you to take time to go and look at that, because the integration of art, architecture, garden is essential, because the work is also about ecology and sustainability and how we think about ourselves and our place in the world. So I'm going to ask you, Reena, thinking about first the lungs, the work with 2 species of plant, and from those plants we're looking at rivers, and then from rivers that divide and sustain. Ask your thoughts on what made you think, the selection process that went to bring these works to Sri Lanka at this moment.
Thank you. A big thank you. And I'm so grateful and honored to be here. And so thank you to all of you who've been working on bringing my work here. I've had a very long friendship with Suhanya, and this is such a special occasion to be part of the 75th anniversary of this magical garden, which I have come to in the past. So it's the first time I came, there was this sort of instant relationship, which I'm sure everyone here knows more about this place than I do. But I felt deeply honored to be invited. So thank you. But speaking of the work that is in the house, I think we, Shayari, Aneesha, and between us, we were having these conversations about what might enter the house without it imposing or disturbing anything that already exists. I mean, the work that they do here is really, the preservation is so key, and yet, like Suhanya said, it's a living entity and it's constantly undergoing change, and so to come to the first work that you mentioned about the lungs, I mean, it's called Siamese trees, and it's formed with a kind of, I've been looking at the sort of hybrid species of birds, animals, trees, flowers, and which are conjoined species with names that where one half comes from each side of countries that are either in conflict across borders. So this one is a coming together of symbols from North and South Korea. So they're national trees, the pine and the hibiscus, and so it forms piniscus. And yet in this case, there is of course a lot of association of one body and this kind of, sort of interconnectedness with and our dependence with oxygen source and exchange. And yet it's also about this whole subterranean system of connection that trees have, where they communicate through fungi, through chemical signals that they pass on to each other when there's danger, threat, or nourishment that they exchange. So I think the idea of exchange, of circularity, of our bodies being so connected to, and the relationship with the natural habitat, some of those ideas certainly encapsulate this. I mean, the medium that I work with is, in this case, is not a natural medium, but it's obviously recycled. So it's made using the electric cable, which is both a transmitter of energy exchange, as communication cable that actually forms these roots. So it's on the one hand a conduit, a carrier, and a barrier at the same time. So it's kind of bringing together these ideas of conflict and confluence. And yet, when you come to a place like this, I think everything that you know or think about, you want to silence it and slow down and just lay things to rest.
From there is a beautiful concertina book. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that book, and then we can go out into the outside.
Yeah, I mean, so they were specifically, of course, the origin, if I have to think about why my engagement with areas of conflict is, of course, our dependence on rivers. I mean, as life, as lifelines of civilizations that grow around rivers, our own connection to water is both having come from the seas. But yet, in this case, I'm looking at the intersection of the artificially drawn borders between countries. So sort of looking at these national borders, and yet how they intersect with the natural form of the river, which is often either forming boundaries, but also something that obviously rivers don't respect those political boundaries and they flow between them, and yet how we're constantly reshaping the landscape and by claiming ownership to either the water resource and so a lot of those ideas of our relationship to rivers, but also how we're reshaping the landscape. And these lines, as an artist, I mean, the line is such an integral part of the artist toolkit. And here I sort of want to reclaim the line back onto paper, but thinking of how histories have really shaped geographies. And while they're contested histories, when the lines come together, they form either they sort of have these resonances of rippled form or the heartbeat and, cardiograms. And so there are several other associations, but essentially it's these sort of lines of division that get subsumed in this sort of universal solvent. And like everything, I mean, rivers sort of reclaim and restore balance.
So those lines lead to the very beautiful lines that you have drawn on Cinnamon Hill with rocks, river rocks.
Yeah, I mean, this was really an extension in conversation. And in fact, instinctually, the first thing that that stayed with me from my last visit was about how Jeffrey had, had sort of concealed the separation, which of course Suhanya can tell you more about.
The road with the hawa. It's called a hawa way, which is a architectural conceit to pretend that it's a unbroken space when in fact there is a road that goes through it.
Absolutely, and that sense of continuity and connection and how the sightlines really seem seamless. And here, I mean, all of these lines may be lines of division, but they sort of come together in a very fluid geography. And that is, I think, essentially what the form of the river as something that will eventually restore and renew. And so eventually I think there'll be grass growing all around it, and it'll be completely taken over.
So Fluid Geographies is also the title of the work and the exhibition that you've made for us, Reena. Thank you. Maybe we move across to the others. Yes?
Thank you, Reena and Suhanya. It was nice to hear you speak about working in Lunuganga specifically. And I think, as you have said, it's such a special place because you can't separate working in art or working in architecture with the space and with with all the natural elements. And I know we're very early in our conversation. Well, in some ways, I don't think we are early in our conversations because I think we've been having them for a long time. And each of you in your practice actually brings, like with Reena, these questions to the space. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of the questions or themes that maybe you hope, of course, we know that being here will change everything, but some of the initial things that are striking you at Lunuganga.
First of all, I want to thank you and for the team to have me and invite me to do some this more like a dream project for me. because like grew up in like in Sri Lanka, and how this Baba's like architecture and everything sort of like plays a significant role in the industry, like in the art scene. So for me, like to work on such a project is like such a dream come true project. So for me, like I want to kind of start about when I came to Lunuganga. It was last year, I think, during the 100-year project. So I had like a quick walkthrough with you, and this is the second time I'm actually here. So for me, like to kind of think about like what to actually start, there's so much to take. So when I came here, I just really wanted to come like more like an open sketchbook to think about what I can really absorb throughout this process, because I feel like, you know, there's so many connections and, you know, themes and that I could actually explore through my work, because I kind of see like, you know, some of my works are actually related to what's really like, you know, here, it's happening here. So there are like a few things that I would love to highlight, like maybe like, no, I'm not sure whether I'm going to like go for it, but, you know, maybe like these are the ideas that I want to kind of think about. But also it's kind of like a great opportunity to like to maybe the audience to also see like how these works actually grows throughout this season, you know. So because this is like, you know, usually like for me, like the artists, the people get to see the final product, but now they just also going to see like what it's like to start the project, you know. So this is very exciting for me. So for me, like I'm kind of thinking about, usually the one thing that I really talk during my last solo exhibition is about the objects and the things that we collected. So that's one thing that you do in the Bawa shows, that you kind of, you know, kind of talk about the stories behind these objects and the furnitures. So these are the things that I also sort of like I think about in a very personal way in during my show, like in the last time. Also, we were kind of like confined in this space, and, you know, didn't really get to like explore the outside world. So during that time, I kind of like to see like what these like a household stuff could tell a story about things, you know. So, and also that was one of the things that I'm really thinking about. At the same time, you know, I'm into this cartography and making maps and whatever. So I'm also coming from Silva, and which is also more like an island, and the water bodies and just like this. So kind of really keen to like think about these oral histories, and, you know, like that's what I work there. So when I think about the oral histories and the places like these hidden maps in the neighborhood, kind of like I just sort of like bring life to that by like exploring the stories and, you know, rethinking about the maps and this psychogeographic map that just running on my head. I kind of make it like a visual form of that. So in that way also, like I kind of really think about what I could explore here. Maybe like there are so many like hidden things that I could think about, you know, or maybe there's a hidden ecosystem that's, you know, hidden there, but maybe we fail to see that. But it's also because of the garden project, I'm just really excited to kind of explore outside now. So that's one of the things I'm like at the moment thinking about. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you especially to the Bawa Trust and the Lunuganga Trust for entrusting me to be able to work in this incredible space. It's not something I ever imagined when I studied Bawa's work. And when I was studying architecture as a student, Geoffrey Bawa's work was very much a point of refuge for me, because it was so much outside of the canon, and I certainly didn't encounter it at architecture school, but I did find it myself, and it was such a point of inspiration because it really offered for me a discourse and a way of looking at the world that hybridized so many conditions and so many identities. And coming from Johannesburg, where I feel we have so many contexts and so many conditions, so many ways of life, incredible rituals and life forms that are really waiting to be translated into different kinds of architecture, I found Geoffrey Bawa's work incredibly inspiring. And so to visit here for the first time, of course, without any idea that I'd be working with you or that we'd have this long, beautiful, ongoing relationship, firstly was such a gift and was so immense. And it was all the more gift, I think, because it was also on the 9th of May, 2022, the eye of the storm and the height of the Aragalaye, when, you know, the country was really going through an immense wave of public protest. And I remember on that evening, and we talked about this earlier, getting ready to get onto the plane when you called me, Shayari, and you said, you know, if you don't want to come, we completely respect your decision. our country is going through something at the moment, and we can discuss another format for the lecture. Perhaps it can be online. And I was very conflicted at that moment. I thought, do I come? Do I not come? And something that you said on that day really stays with me until now, and I often reflect on it in my practice as well. I asked you, what is the stance of the Trust in this time? And you said, well, for us, the most important thing to do at times like this, at times of crisis, is to get to work. And I remember that when I arrived, I saw on the news that so much of the protest was also so cultural. There were people who were engaging in performance. There were people who were working with textiles and fabrics and creating signage that was also of a revolution. And I was so inspired by that. I remember coming here to Lunuganga with yourself and Channa and talking about the power of culture in a time like this. But also, and we were just thinking about this on the drive today, coming today from Colombo and really seeing the city alive and seeing the village alive on our way to Lunuganga was a very different experience to last year, when the city was kind of in suspension and everything was locked down. But Lunuganga itself sort of feels the same. It's this moment of reflection and this moment of constancy. And I think it's also really important that we have and we protect fiercely places of refuge and places of imagination. And with the installation, I hope that this is something that I can work on. The brief from the Trust has been around reading and literature, and we've talked a lot about the power of transporting people through words and images. So many people got to know of Lunuganga first in books, in architecture libraries. Yesterday we heard when Clara described the origins of her film project that she first encountered Lunuganga in the architecture school library. And that same sensibility is something that we also want to bring to people here in the garden. So thinking about a place for literature, a place for reading, of course, that was something that was so important to Bawa, but also a place where we can communally share, we can share visions, we can bring material from across the world that is resonant with the legacy of Bawa, and we can create a place for people to be able to share and gather in these experiences and visions.
Can I just jump in and ask Reena to also speak a little bit? I mean, what we are hearing is two artists who are in the process of making work. And it's always such a privilege to be able to hear what process looks like, the forming of things. Reena, you're at the sort of the other end of that formation, but also the beginning for others, all of us, to experience. So I just wanted to ask you your thoughts of being here and the process that you went through in forming ideas for Lunuganga, which means salt river as well, given our thoughts around rivers.
So, of course, the process, Suhanya, was not very long. I have to say the engagement was far more recent, but the initial exchange really began with locating it, of course, in the context of the river being, and in fact, for the selection of the work, like I said, the team was really helpful in drawing out within the practice that which would resonate with the space and with the place here. And for me, Chris is here, and I should thank Chris and the team for actually realizing the project. And this is something that I just spoke of when I said, what really struck my mind was this sort of sense of continuity again in the space, in the kind of rhythm, the circularity of flow of, and yet in the form that it took with the lines coming together. It was really looking at local material that's easily found, which can go back. So it had to be something that is evocative of those man-made divisions, not really a built environment, but also suggestive of that, and yet something that is easily found here. So we managed to gather some. In fact, Shayari, you were saying that they're really like river stones, the ones that we borrowed, and so it's a kind of now return back to where they came from, and I think we have to still think about how we put them back, or will they just grow over with the grass? So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that Baba said was about this thing of how you commune with, this sort of universal communion, and not just on a planetary scale. I mean, one is thinking, of course, about not just our role as citizens, but like the Earth citizens, and the idea of the Earth family, as to think of the other species and other forms of life that coexist, and that's something that we really learn through his practice, that it's so understated. Everything, it grows on you as you spend time, and it's not something that you just walk into in a spectacular installation. So I didn't want something that would kind of impose and something that just sort of weaves in and also disappears. So it makes its presence and yet can be effaced.
It's an important thought, just because Jeffrey, when he wrote his the trust deed, made it very clear that art, architecture, ecology, environment were essential to the trust's work, and all of us knew that Lunuganga needed to be the place where that first is expressed. So part of the weekend's activities includes us now sharing with a broader public the work being done on the ecology aspect, the environmental aspects of sustaining a space like this, with the two islands and how the sanctuaries, the bird sanctuaries, the hog deer sanctuary, but they are integrated. It's what Sumayya said about we need to fiercely protect places of refuge but renewal. And they teach us how, nature, what nature has to teach us actually is something really profound. And the relationship between all of the living things in the garden is integrated, and to weave them, as you say, is such a beautiful thing.
Great. I just have a comment. It's not really a question, but when we were going through this house together, Reena, you said, there's already so much here, and we had taken away some, like the clock that's in front of Reena's map, and she said, no, it's okay, it can be there. And I was thinking about the fact that in a garden, it's never an empty plot. There's something there. There's always the terrain. And in many ways, your engagement here has been with what's here. And to hear you've exhibited across the world in all these amazing galleries. But what it means to be in a garden, I think, is quite specific. And in our conversations today, each of you, it was striking to me, mentioned this question of scale, of the microcosmic and then the cosmic. And I think, again, just being here together outdoors with our feet on the ground and with the sky above us, that it's so palpable. And that was my comment, really. And I don't know if you had anything to offer on that, because I know you've all been thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, but as an artist, I think it's so rare for those of us who've shown in, galleries and museums around the world, but to be able to really respond to the living conditions and not really enter a white cube where, like you said, it's a clean canvas and you're, so where you're thinking about the light and and all the other elements that are so key. And I think it's almost like a plant that is either in a natural light or one that's a potted one in an artificial light, and that it's so for me it's really a very, very rare occasion, and which is why it's so special to be here and to be given such an opportunity to think about the gardens. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, what I feel about like mostly when I work on some projects, where I have the creative freedom to work on things, I always like think about how I can work on something that's not really alienating that space. So I just really want to kind of think about like what really will fit into this space and how we could like make something that's very seamless and something that really syncs with the space. And so that is something that we see here. Like, you really feel the nature is like kind of taking over the buildings, and it's just kind of, it feels like, you're kind of living in this like a very much like a human and nature kind of hybrid space. So for me, that's very kind of like, I'm very excited about it, because for me to think about like, I really wanted to work with natural light and the space outdoor, and also this is going to be like maybe my first outdoor installation. So from that space also, like, when I work on this kind of very confined spaces, it's like your creativity, the work you produce is also sort of like limited to that space. So here, when you think about it, also like you look at the space and even the work that you do think that's the biggest one will be like the smallest piece here. So in that way, like really like kind of thinking about how we could you really work on this space and the garden that you have, and how you could work with the materials and to kind of keep it for too long. Like these are the so many questions that I should explore, and I feel like I'm just really like to get this kind of opportunity to kind of explore that part is something that I'm really excited about. Thank you.
I think on the question of working with a site, there are all architecture in the world for me fits into two categories: either the category of listening or the category of projecting. That's all. And if we think of every single architectural method or discourse or canon, it's one of these two. And if we look at many African ways of being, many Southern ways of being, often it was about listening to the landscape, about being with a place, about listening to and collaborating with the seasons. And if we think of most colonial methods, what they did for the most part, the worst examples, is to project a voice onto a place as if nothing existed there before, without really taking into consideration what the place is about. And Jeffrey's work for me is an architecture of deep listening. I was so struck by so much of the script in Clara's film last night, and the one line said that it was almost as if the architecture is enticed out of the shadows. And I really believe in this kind of architecture that allows us to quieten down and to listen profoundly to space, to look deeply and to appreciate what is already there that we might not have seen so clearly before. And for me, Jeffrey's work really does this. So I hope there are also stories in this garden, and I'm sure there are many, that we can also work with and work through that we want to be able to highlight. But also I think on the project of gardens, there is something so profound, and I think that should be present in every single project, and that is this phenomenon that brings us closer to the microcosmic and the macrocosmic, so to speak. On one of my current projects in Belgium, we have been working with a very, very unknown and unrecognized story. So the brief for the project was for a pedestrian bridge in a town called Vilvoorde. And I'll try to explain it very quickly. But when I looked at the map, this town had a very, very active waterways. And because of its position on the waterways and the ways that it led into the sea, it was one of the most active places that kept people from the Congo. And we found that the first person to have studied in Belgium from the Congo studied in this very town. He was a genius. He became a horticulturalist in the town. He was also a gardener. And his research contributed to what the landscape of Belgium looks like. He then fought for Belgium in the war and experienced extreme discrimination and violence, like all people from the Congo who fought for Belgium did. And he used his position to advocate for the lives of Black people to be more equitable. So he changed the legal system so that wages were more fair. He organized several Pan-African conferences all over Europe with Du Bois and several others. He really, really made a huge contribution to the physical landscape of the country and also intangibly the way that it included marginalized people. And he was very sadly assassinated at the end of his life. He was poisoned. His history is completely unrecognized for someone who has so phenomenally changed the course of history. And I really wanted the project to be an homage to him. So we created a series of conjoined boat structures, and these boats draw on the boats that we see from the Congo. These incredible carved wooden structures, carved usually from singular tree barks, and each of them is planted with species that come from his horticultural research. And then there are several smaller boat structures along the river, and these are going to embed themselves along the riverbank and pollinate previously industrial zones where people from the Congo toiled on the land. And I think that's also something that we have to remember about landscape. Somehow it's always inextricably connected to our bodies, to people who have toiled, of course, to food and nourishment that it gives us. But there's such a visceral connection, and on this point of either architecture listening or projecting, I think too often architecture has kept the weather out. One of the most beautiful things about staying at number 11 is really understanding how much Bauer has blurred the weather line, where you don't know whether you're inside or outside, and it doesn't really matter. You are still protected, so to speak, but you're living with, communing with, and convening with trees.
So any questions from our audience?
I think it's just incredible to be sitting over here, hearing the birds sort of chirp. And you're absolutely right, Sumaya. It takes me back to the documentary that we all saw yesterday. This is actually a question for Firi. And Firi, I've been a real admirer of your work. And you've often drawn these caged birds, right? And I'm just thinking that here you are in a completely uncaged, open environment. So I'm just a provocation to you on how that feels and how you're going to use this in the context of all those works of yours where you've got these birds, the most beautiful birds, but in an assortment of cages.
Thank you so much. Actually, so then maybe I'll give a small brief about the work that I did for that series. And so the series that I worked during the series called Enclosed, which is my last solo exhibition. So where I work in my confined home space. So this is right after my father's loss, and we had this pandemic was hitting, and then we almost everybody was like home by myself. So during this time of like grieving, and what I see sort of like from coming from this city boy, so I kind of like thinking about how it is to feel like inside. Most of the time I'm like kind of looking at this inspiration outside my house, but this is the time we actually sat there and like to think about what's really around us. And so one of the few thing I see like from few artists that working on that, I think this is the time we actually kind of like a thought about the materials that we have, like very limited restrictions, then how we could work with what we have around it. So during that time only, I just sort of like to work on these cages where it sort of like represents my home, and to kind of to talk about the cage itself. It's not like to place to confine, but it's to kind of like to think about a safe haven, like during that time, where we feel we should be home, kind of like in a space. So, and also like now I see like we also had a conversation about like how it is like to kind of draw these birds, and because I never seen these kind of birds in the wild. We always like in the city, we see them in the cages, and to kind of understand their body languages, the way they move, and the feathers they have. You kind of like when you just grew up with them, you kind of understand how it is like to to kind of have these birds, to see their moods and, how their certain body language says something about it. And there, like, I kind of see a reflection of our human nature. Like I saw myself, like, sometimes when I'm stressed about something, started to kind of like a nail biting, and even without knowing about it. So then I see the birds, how they stress, they pluck their own feathers. So these little kind of things that I started to kind of observe. I mean, and that the lockdown really helped me to kind of think more about it, just to like actually like look at them and, start to understand these behaviors. And so whenever like when you see like these birds drawings and stuff like that, you kind of, it's more like you go for like this bird seeing, like a bird watchers, and they kind of spend time in the forest and kind of understand that bird. For me, it's a really like a different thing for me. So to kind of to come to this place and to look at those kind of thing outside the world, like, outside the cage. So it's really kind of driving me to think about what we could do about it. I'm just like, that's what I was, one of the first thing I just like kind of walking around the neighborhood, like in this garden, I noticed there's certain sounds and the birds that, even this bamboo kind of, the trees just kind of like are making this noise and stuff. These little things sort of like what I kind of really want to look into. That kind of makes me very curious. Maybe because I know the bird sound of my parrot, so then I know it's a parrot. But here it's like, it's other species are around. So like maybe there's another kind of bird that I would love to see, like, maybe how they are communicating. So these are the things I would love to kind of check. Yeah. So this is something that I'm really excited about.
I'd just like to say a little bit to enlighten everybody about this garden, because I was one of the architects who worked with Jeffrey for a long time. My name is Philip Fowler. I'm from India. I worked with him continuously 7 years on the Parliament, all the hotels down south. And Ben Tot, as he used to call Lunuganga then, was really a spiritual home. A monk once came and visited it, and after spending a couple of hours, came and told Jeffrey, this is the most spiritual place. So if we all go to church on Sundays, every weekend, if it were possible, Jeffrey would come to the garden. This is where he would recharge his batteries. He'd spend the morning with the gardeners going around, keeping the garden in as pristine, in his mind, an appearance. And he used to say, visitors don't realize how much of effort it takes to keep it the way it is. This is also a center from where he handled all the projects down south. Rohuna University, it took 6 years to build. There was always something going on at Triton, Serendip, Neptune, Ventura Beach. And it was a perfect sort of launching pad. He would come down and tell us, come over. If there was no guests over here, we would stay over here or in one of the hotels. But the garden grew over the years, and until Jeffrey sadly passed on. Like the back then, I used to turn up here every 2 or 3 months. I used to tell my friends, I come here to preserve my insanity. So it was for Jeffrey really his spiritual home, his temple, his church, his mosque, whatever. And he would, if you observed him over here, he would just sit down quietly, looking across, smoking on a cigarette. And then in the evening, generally, if he would invite a few close friends over, sit on his favorite corner of the lawn, enjoying a glass of arak and chatting about the world. So this, for him, is where he experimented mentally of what he was going to do physically in the projects that he built all around the island and then overseas as well. And it's slowly, different parts I see have grown in a period of time. And I think yesterday he had said that he's now left it to nature to take its course, to be the landscape architect after him, to give back to nature he gave to it. And one of the things in the film yesterday that with him there was no interior or exterior. Architecture was one seamless series of spaces that had walls that created spaces within buildings, trees, foliage that created spaces outside. And whether you were inside or outside, it was all the same. And every single bit had to be perfect. That's why all the interiors were done by him. In the hotels, the waiters' uniforms, the cutlery, the iconic ashtray at Triton. I remember when Triton was completed and Charlie De Silva, who was the chairman, came to see it, and he told Jeffrey it's better than I even imagined. And Ulrich Plessner, his former partner, was with him. And he asked Jeffrey who was that, and he said, well, that's a client. And then Ulrich looked at the brass ashtray and said, Jeffrey, this is absolutely you. One, it's made of brass. Two, it's heavy. And it's deep enough so that the ash isn't blown away by the sea breeze. You know, we used to get gales over there. So everything had to be perfect. Everything had to be in harmony. And if you walk through the garden quietly and look at stuff, the only criticism I have of the garden now is it's a little too perfect. Jeffrey always allowed it to have that bit of nature which was a little overgrown in certain places, which is where he wished. But otherwise, this is really his temple, as I said, his church, his spiritual home.
I have a question for Sumayya and in general your past practice and your future one. And referencing what we saw yesterday in the beautiful movie about this attitude of excluding from the side some parts of the landscape to frame it and to describe it. And this is something that, for example, we talked about this morning in your Serpentine Pavilion, Sumayya. So using architecture as a way of framing the landscape and kind of describing it through this, juxtaposition. So that would be my first kind of comment, and I would love to hear more about this. And then the second one that also came, kind of the second idea that came to my mind, again, visiting the beautiful spaces and listening and seeing the movie yesterday, is how really I see Baba's practice as both making space, but also living space. So living space for, nature, for human to, appropriate and to live and to also shape. And I would love to hear, more from you and maybe like in reference of your practice and your future projects.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marta, for the question. I think Bauer was a genius in being able to frame things for us to see and heighten and highlight things for us to appreciate that are already there. And it's my hope that all architects do that in some way or form. I think something that I'm working to do in my practice is also to do that with stories and with histories, particularly stories that are underrated. And if I think about the project that we're working on together with Terma Art in Manchester, it's very much about honoring, again, an event that was unrecognized in history, the Pan-African Conference in Manchester. But we're also, in that project, working to leave space in a very urban environment for a garden to grow that might have resonance with communities in terms of ingredients that will have been present or resonant with migrant communities from African diasporas. So a garden to be able to allow these to grow, to be able to provide food and sustenance for people to gather and commune around, but also to allow space for people to sit and reflect. An environment that is currently quite harsh and quite hard-surfaced. And I'm also very grateful for this experience because it's allowing us to appreciate being in this garden and take something into that work and into those projects.
On behalf of the Jeffrey Baba Trust, I'd like to thank each and every one of you who have gathered here today for this talk. And we really hope to see some familiar faces over the weekend. Thank you.